KingsServant, thanks for coming on. Really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Tom. Well, basically, I'm what you might call a lay apologist. I'm not a scholar. I don't have any formal qualifications, but for a number of years, I've been studying Christian theology and the history behind Christianity for the purpose of sharing the gospel with people who believe in things that I do. Most of my work has been with Jehovah's Witnesses, Muslims, some Mormons, Christadelphians, different cultic groups. So this is the first real engagement that I've had with atheists beyond just people I would come across doing straight evangelism.
Cool. So the topic is, are the Gospels historically accurate? And could you tell me your position on that?
Yeah, and I hold theologically that the Gospels are inerrant, but that's a conclusion that I come to based on being a Christian. So it's not something I would try to persuade a atheist or any non-Christian of generally, except perhaps a Muslim. But I do have a case that I would present for the reliability of the Gospels and why they should be taken seriously historically. And from that, I think, of course, there are leaving Christianity, and good theology would result in the idea that they are completely accurate.
So Gospels historically reliable. You said that your religious position is that they are inerrant. I am, of course, as an atheist, I've studied a little bit about the Gospels and their origins, specifically things like they're also authors weren't the apostles. They were guys. They're written in Greek, not Hebrew. And so it was written by Greek academics at the time period, Greek authors, scribes or whatever. And there were a number of problems with each of the transcripts. They have errors, spelling errors, like everything else, additions, contradictions. But more importantly, in the field of history, it doesn't support miracles, magic, mythical creatures, paranormal, supernatural, UFOs, any of those claims from any time period historically, no matter what the source is unreliable. It's just the field of history just doesn't accept it in general. So why would you go beyond what the academic scope of the methodology allows to accept the miracles part when it's not acceptable for any other case in history?
Yeah, well, I think, to be honest, I would deny the place that you're starting from. Obviously, I'm not an atheist. Even if I were not a Christian, I don't see any reason necessarily to reject all supernatural claims. So, yeah, I don't deny all miracle claims outside of the Bible and apply some sort of a double standard. I don't think that that's a good reason to reject something as being historically reliable because it records miraculous events. So, yeah, I think there are good reasons to take the gospel seriously historically, and if there are similarly good reasons in the texts of other religions that record other miraculous events, then I would take them seriously historically as well.
All right, what would you consider good evidence for his miracles or magic or any of the things that don't have a basis? Because the reason history doesn't accept those is that
you're kind of assuming that they don't have a basis. So, like, that's an assumption that I have no inclination to grant.
Well, sure. I mean, from my studying of history and my conversation with academics, that seems to be the consensus point of view. So it's not really an assumption. That's just from my knowledge field. Yeah, there was a paper. I've read a number of papers by Christians on this topic arguing against it. Like Mike Licona has a paper on historians and miracle claims where he's trying to argue that the methodology of history, excluding miracle claims, they shouldn't do it or something. But like the very first sentence is, most historians and biblical scholars hold to it that the study of miracle claims lies outside of the bounds of a historian acting within the professional capacity or something like that.
Well,
And so,
that Lycona would come to a conclusion like that, since I believe he's on quite good terms with Craig Keener, who wrote a massive 2-volume set on miracles.
Yep.
I think they're pretty close to each other, so I'd be kind of surprised for Mike to take something that's so directly opposed to his friend Craig Keener, who is an equally good scholar. In my opinion,
Well, no,
probably the better.
so he agrees. He agrees that miracles should be taken seriously, but he's describing the historical narrative of what the field thinks. So the field disagrees. The field thinks miracles are outside of the bounds of history, and he's trying to argue in that paper that they shouldn't be. So he's just describing the current view
Yeah, well,
of
I
the.
think it's quite obvious to most people that most of academia is run, or at least led by people these days who have a secular, atheistic, materialistic worldview. So I don't think it's too surprising that most of academia would think that way, especially recent times.
Well, sure, but I think that's a progress, not regress. So it'd be like most people think gravitation or Einstein's theory of gravity is correct today because that's what the evidence supports. So the reason methodologically historians don't accept miracles or magic or any of those things is the same reason they're not accepted in law. We have better explanations of all of that data in delusion, illusion, misconception, human psychological errors, et cetera, and those things would have a stronger basis of evidence to explain the data of the testimony of seeing a unicorn or magic or miracles or whatever, and that would be a more plausible explanation of the data than to say the miracle actually happened. Therefore, historians can't go beyond the evidence to posit a new ontology of some kind. So, like, if we see a hoof print in the snow, you couldn't say a unicorn did it until you actually had like empirical verified evidence of unicorns actually existing to potentially do it. You could say a horse did it. So, like, if I wrote in a document a horse created the hoof prints, that would be historically believable. But if I said a unicorn did it, historians could never believe that because there's nothing I could provide through my testimony that would count as empirical evidence that unicorns actually existed to cause this thing. And so, given the possibility of things that have been verified to exist independent of our imagination, the historians can take those as like Lego pieces to fill in the blank and say, okay, psychological issue, that one, we have that, that's a real piece that we know is not imaginary. Delusion, yep, we got that one. Hallucination, yep, we got that one. But unicorn is not in that collection of pieces, not in the pieces of the things that have been verified to actually exist. And so they couldn't actually say, yes, a unicorn actually existed and the person saw it. That would be outside of the bounds of history because history is limited to those pieces that have been demonstrated to exist independent of imagination. And I think that methodology is a rational one. I think it's very justified, and you get the most accurate conclusions about history from that methodology. And so why would we reject that methodology for any reason?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I guess it's, as I've said, I've never really talked to atheists all that much. But to me, it's you guys who are actually in the minority here. Most people in the world do believe in God in some sense. And so it's not positing a new ontology, it's positing a being which most people already believe in. It's
Well,
not.
just to clarify, when I say new, I don't mean it's just new that people have thought of it. I mean new as in it's a thing that hasn't been demonstrated to exist independent of imagination. So like rocks are not new. We've demonstrated rocks exist. Cats not new. But if you wanted to say a new species or a weakly interactive massive particle or like a new thing in physics, a graviton, whatever, those would all be new in the fact that they haven't yet been demonstrated to exist independent of people's imaginations. And so you would need something more than personal testimony to justify belief in that thing. You need empirical tests, something like an actual fossil or something of the new species. You need more empirical data to justify the belief that this thing exists beyond just personal testimony. And so because there's no empirical evidence of unicorns or miracles or magic or God, those to introduce those things into a hypothesis would be equivalent to introducing in graviton or a weakly interactive massive particle or new species or something, leprechauns. And so until we have empirical evidence of those things, then they would be new ontologies in the fact that they don't have current empirical bases.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure, first of all, that God would fit into a category of something that could be verified empirically, whether true or false. And besides that, I mean, once again, it's your assessment, and I respect your assessment that you think that there isn't sufficient evidence to believe in God and so forth. But once again, you're in the minority here. By most people's standards, God is not something which is new or completely unverified without evidence. I mean, this is an atheistic assumption that there is no evidence for God. So I don't think that it's something that somebody who's not an atheist, an assumption that they should carry with them when they read the Gospels. It's something that a small group of people in the world, atheists, carry with them, why they cannot accept any miracle claims, no matter how good the evidence is for them. So, yeah, I just think that you're holding my minority worldview here, and there's nothing wrong with being in the minority. I'm in the minority on certain positions in scholarship, as I'm expecting to talk about. If you want to talk about why I believe the Gospels are more trustworthy than most scholars do, but yeah, I don't think many will take, or at least ought to, by their worldview, take with them the assumption that an account that contains a miracle claim cannot be trustworthy or reliable. It's only a particular worldview that does that, and it's not one that I hold or most people in the world do.
Well, it doesn't have anything to do with worldviews. It has to do with what accurately gives us information about history, which methodology works the best. And the methodology that assumes those kinds of things are false is the one that accurately gets the data right most of the time. And so it's not really an assumption they don't have any evidence. We have a methodology that does not assume those things. What?
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. I don't see how you would judge that it's a materialistic methodology that usually gets right. Like, you would have to have some other standard to know what the actual history is, with the materialist and the supernaturalist explanations, and we don't have an independent access to that. So,
like archaeology, geology, we can test it to other fields that have interactions with history.
Yeah, well, I would reject the idea that always supports or even consistently, to give the benefit of the doubt for some that might be outside. I would reject the idea that history, whether written or archaeological, would necessarily support a materialistic understanding of what's happened in the past. Yeah, I don't see that at all.
What do you mean? Because as far as I know, there isn't any support in history or whatever for, or I mean, archaeology and geology, any of the things we can verify. Essentially, I think there's zero support for any miracle or magic of any kind ever. That seems to be like, of all of the things we've ever studied, we've never found any evidence whatsoever of any of the supernatural claims in any of the empirically verifiable fields. So I don't, if you had evidence of that, that would be great. And atheists aren't just rejecting it on principle. Like, if magic exists or whatever, we'd be happy with that. We wouldn't mind whatsoever. But there's just, I don't see any evidence of it.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I came here to talk about the Gospels and why I believe they're reliable. So I think that when a suitable approach is taken to the Gospels, we assume the unreliability of anything that reports supernatural events, and treated otherwise as any other historical documents with the same kinds of tests for reliability. I think that we find that they compare very favorably to other historical documents and should be taken similarly, even when they report miracle claims, because personally, and I know most of your audience was, I don't see any reason to take supernatural events as any differently to naturalistic ones necessarily. It's only if the evidence for them is extremely weak that they should be rejected. If the evidence for them is as good as is comparable to other events, then they should be accepted like other events.
Well, I think that's the fundamental problem with the difference between the theistic view and the atheistic view. Like, assuming assuming that your belief is already true is begging the question. Like, assuming that miracles already happen, and therefore, like, it's perfectly reasonable to say if we had a lot of evidence of miracles today, like we could like pray and regrow people's limbs or whatever, we could then use induction to infer that miracle claims of historical people in the past were done in a similar method. So we know miracles happen today. There's someone who claimed miracles in the past. That could have been a miracle. So that's perfectly reasonable. Just like we know dogs exist today. If someone claimed to see a dog in the past, perfectly reasonable. But because we have essentially no evidence of miracles today at all in any field, just academic consensus on literally everything in pretty much every country all around the world, zero supernatural anything. That means that it seems as irrational to say that there was actually a miracle as to say that Romulus and Remus were raised by a wolf and founded Rome. That all of those kinds of miracle claims. King Arthur brought the sword from the fairy in the water and made Merlin and the dragons and stuff. Like, all of that just completely irrational to believe. Not because there's something inherently wrong with the writings or the authorship, but because we literally have no evidence any of those things exist in reality. And so it seems like you're skipping the first step in the methodology of history, and you're going to like trying to compare the level of authorship, the level of credibility of the testimony, that kind of stuff, the other eyewitnesses or other references to the stuff that happened. But you're skipping the first step, which is verifying
I
the
didn't
possibility.
have to be convinced to be atheist to begin with.
What?
Sorry?
I missed the first part. Could you repeat that?
Oh yeah, I said I don't have to be convinced to be a theist to begin with. I approach whatever I read as someone who is a theist necessarily. So there is a degree in which I'm afraid that we might end up talking past each other if this track continues. It's not something I want, but yeah. I approach whatever I'm reading as a theist. And that includes, if I'm reading some Roman Catholic miracle claim, I approach that as a theist. I may or may not be convinced of the miracle claim associated with whatever saint. I'm not a Roman Catholic myself, just to be clear about that. But if the evidence their miracle claim, I won't accept their religion for theological reasons, but I'm not automatically biased that I have to reject any miracle claim that comes out of Roman Catholicism. I can accept them if I consider the evidence good enough. And that fits within my worldview. Most miracle claims, I would agree with the atheist, are not sufficiently supported to be reasonably believed. But I think that there are some that are. And yeah, that needs to be judged based on the historical evidence. And I'm not going to judge it on a presupposition that if it's a miracle claim, then it's necessarily not going to be true.
Gotcha. So I just want to like outline that as a methodological difference, starting point, and then go to the next step. The next step would be is like, how do you think you can evaluate which miracle claims count as having enough evidence and not? Because this is also something I've studied quite a bit into, and Christianity does not have the best evidence of miracle claims. There's significantly more evidence for the Hindu ones because they're still happening, or they're claimed to still be happening. Santi Sai Baba, who is supposedly the reincarnation or the second coming of Sai Baba something or another, did miracle claims in front of tens of thousands of people. There were tens of thousands of eyewitnesses who all claimed to see the miracle claims directly, and so those seem to have significantly more evidence than anything in Christianity. And so we can go to other cultures who still claim to see miracles.
That would be an example of a supernatural event that I would be inclined to take very seriously.
Right.
If you actually have this, which I'm not suggesting that you're making it up or anything like that. If this has happened, then I would have no problem accepting that religion's miracle claim as being true.
Right. Well, my question is more about
religion, but yeah. So it's not like I believe that the miracles in the Gospels are the only ones that are believable.
Well, my question is, what is the criterion for establishing which miracle claims you would take seriously or which would not? That's more the question.
Yeah. Well, the same criteria that I would use for evaluating other historical claims. I wouldn't use a different standard.
What is it though?
Well, for example, multiple independent attestation would be a very good place to start. It's not the only criteria. You can use criteria of embarrassment. If there's a miracle that takes place that makes the person telling about the miracle not look good, that would support the miracle claim. If you have other people giving bad explanations of what happened in this event that are less believable than the miracle claim itself, then that again would support the idea that the miracle is the best explanation of what is available. So ultimately, it's what best explains the evidence that's available, relevant to look. And if a miracle is the best explanation, then that's what I'm with. And I think that's a reasonable thing to do.
So the next point, as brought up by Brian Stevens in the chat, is the criterion of embarrassment seems quite arbitrary. Like, I don't think it's used pretty much anywhere in history except by theistic scholars. I don't know of any secular scholars that use that whatsoever for any context in history. It seems like a ad hoc criterion made up by theists in order to try and make their story more believable. I don't know how that having something that is embarrassing would increase the probability of a historical statement being true. That there doesn't seem to be any connection between those two statements. So I don't understand why the criterion of embarrassment would be counted one way or the other.
Okay, so first of all, for Brian Steve's asking the question, I don't have it off the top of my head, but if you go to Inspiring Philosophy's channel, he has a video in which he shows where this is applied outside of the Bible by secular historians. So you can find an explanation there where he does give examples. Like I say, I don't have them off the top of my head, but this isn't.
I am very familiar with that video, and in those examples, none of those are taken seriously in the academic field. So those are kind of like ad hoc things added by those scholars. That's not a criterion used by historians.
Yeah, I think it's fairly common sense as well. If I'm going to make up a story about how I was playing football, or I guess you'd call it soccer, and I got absolutely hammered, and I scored an own goal, right? Would I make a story up about that? Not really. If I make up I scored a hat-trick, then that would be more likely to be something that I would make up because it makes me look good. So it does lend credibility to be giving an account in which I do not look like the good guy, and I look like I'm actually incompetent and I don't know what I'm doing. So the criterion of embarrassment is fairly common sense of the kinds of things which will be made up by someone and the kind of things that won't be.
Well, I don't quite follow that because, like, Greek tragedies or mostly things are embarrassments. There are different cultures who prefer stories of embarrassments over stories of successes, and so there's lots of things like Mary Jane died. The scorpion killed Mary Jane. Does the fact that that's embarrassing for Spider-Man increase the probability that Spider-Man is true? I'd say no. I don't think that stories.
That's just not comparable. I mean, the thing is, you're saying the fact that is embarrassing for Spider-Man does not increase the likelihood that Spider-Man is true. But Spider-Man is not the author. He's not the person telling the story. Do you guys?
No, because it's like if it's written by someone who's advocating for Spider-Man, that would be the same. So, like, say there's a Spider-Man advocate who wants people to know the story of Spider-Man, and they write in something that happened embarrassing to Spider-Man. That would be essentially comparable there. I don't see the difference.
Yeah, well, I think you should, because when you have the disciples telling stories which make themselves look bad, this is different from an author telling a story that makes his fictional character look bad. It's not the same thing. It's not comparable. But yeah,
I don't see how there, because it seems like if there was a person writing a story that they wanted to promote that story, whatever the story is, it could be a story about the apostles or whatever, and they want to tell the story of the apostles and how much they suffered. That's actually a good way to get support, is telling people how much
people do
your
exaggerate
position
the
has
stuff.
suffered.
That would be more.
Right. Right. And if you wanted to tell someone a story of Spider-Man or whatever, and you think Spider-Man is true, you tell the story of how Spider-Man's girlfriend died or whatever. That would make equally as much sense. So to me, I think that telling a story and adding in parts that are embarrassing or something are actually something that makes the story more relatable. If it's just too perfect, people won't accept it. And so I think adding in embarrassing parts of a story is not something that increases the truthiness of the claim. It just increases the relatability of people to be able to understand it, which is the same to adding in successes. I don't see why this would be taken more seriously than any other factor of historical document storytelling.
Yeah, well, I'm saying that I think that a case that involves the person making the case looking bad is less likely to be made. I think that's fairly common sense, but if you have a different opinion, then there's not a great deal I can do about that. I don't know. Are you interested in?
Well, don't you agree that what?
I was just going to say, are you interested in the case that I would actually make for why the gospel should be taken historically seriously? Because I mean, so far
Sure.
it's more philosophical conversation about the nature of miracle claims and so forth, which is never something that I've really taken that much interest in, since atheists have never been part of the people that I've focused on.
Sure.
Yeah, so I guess if we begin with the question of dating for the Gospels, I'm sure you're probably aware of this, TJump, but I don't know if your audience would be. In general, the Gospels would be dated by the average historian to be between about 65 with Mark and AD 90 with John. But there are certain issues with this. And I would like to focus really on the Gospel of John specifically, because it tends to be one that is most attacked for being different from the Synoptic Gospels. Some people would say having a higher Christology and so forth. So there is actually a strong case to be made that John's Gospel was written before 70, which would put it within about 30 years of the life and ministry of Jesus. I don't know if you're familiar with Daniel Wallace's argument from John 5:2. You come across that before?
I think so. I haven't researched that in a while.
Yeah. Well, he says in verse 2 that there is, I'll just read it so I don't misquote anything. John chapter 5, verse 2. Now there is Jerusalem by the sheep market a pool which is called in the Hebrew tongue Bethesda, having 5 porches. Now, he's saying that this is there at the time of writing. Now, obviously we can question whether John is speaking the truth, but he is making the claim that this which still exists at the time of writing. It was destroyed in AD 70. And there's no reference in any of the Gospels to the destruction of the temple as a past event, the destruction of Jerusalem. And I think, especially with the Gospel of John, we should expect that he would have mentioned it. And that the reason for that being in John chapter 2, particularly, Jesus makes the statement that if they destroy this temple, in 3 days he will build again. And John records that after he was risen, they remembered that he said this and that he was speaking of his body. So this is going to be, for one example, of a perfect opportunity when, if the temple had been destroyed at the time of writing, it should have been mentioned as well. And this is a consistent point throughout the Gospels, and particularly John's Gospel. And John does refer from the time of writing that they remembered what happened afterwards. So he's not just recording what happened at the time, he's also making observations looking backwards. And there's no mention of the destruction of Jerusalem at all. And so that's one case that I would make, that John's Gospel should be dated before AD 70. And it's virtually unanimous among scholars. I think it probably is actually unanimous among living scholars, at least, that the Gospel were all written before John, that John was the last Gospel written. So we have something that, if this is correct, is very, very close to the time of the events. And if you don't have any comments about that, we can go on to talk about the location of the events as well, and the evidence that the authors of the Gospels were not only close in time to the lifetime of Jesus, but were close in terms of location. But this is one thing that I would put forward, and it is put forward by Dr. Daniel Wallace, who wrote the standard text for Advanced Biblical Greek, that John was written before AD 70. He's taken a minority position, but he's willing to defend it, and so he's quite right about that. Do you have any comment on that?
Not really, because I usually just take it for granted that they're just eyewitnesses. Like, it doesn't matter to me
Okay.
if it was years later. Like, so I just say, like, they're eyewitnesses who are, I mean, I don't believe it's true, but usually for the sake of the argument, I just say, okay, if they're direct eyewitnesses who wrote it down exactly the second they saw it, it wouldn't make much of a difference for me in this context of the argument. So I don't see the significance of the time period or location as being that important to me. I understand that if it was the case that they were written many years later, or if it was the case they're written by someone from a long distance away, that would make the argument less credible. So I would understand the purpose of the argument, but I don't see how that helps with the conclusion very much.
Well, the question is about whether or not the Gospels should be considered historically reliable. It makes sense to me when I'm making that kind of an assessment. Should I take this book seriously or not? And the events that it records, I want to know, are the authors of the event, of the book, in a position to be saying things which they know what they're talking about or not? I mean, it seems like you'd just be willing to grant that they completely know what they're talking about. I mean, you can argue they're just lying, but I mean, I don't find that convincing at all. I don't know about yourself, if you would.
Well, I don't think any of them were lying. I just think it's human. So have you done the...
Yeah.
What?
I don't know. I'm listening.
Have you done the outsider test for faith?
I'm sorry?
Have you done the outsider test of faith?
No, like atheism's never really been my thing, but the history of Christianity is important for whatever group I'm talking to.
So it's essentially we take a hypothetical story. Pine Creek, Doug Pine Creek uses a story that his great grandfather flew over the Grand Canyon. He says, All right. I have the story of there's a document you find that says that my great grandfather flew over the Grand Canyon. Would you place that, like, you're supposed to figure it? We're in a library and you want to know, should you place this in the mythological section, the historical section? And so all you know is that there's this guy who was claimed to have flown over the Grand Canyon unaided, just jumped, just flew. Would you put that in the fictional section or the historical section?
Well, in the context that I'm being given, I'd put it in the mythology section, right? But
Yep.
if we go back to the example you offered before of the miracles that were witnessed by tens of thousands of people in Hinduism, so I mean, I have no bias towards accepting a miracle in Hinduism. I'm sure you believe me on that. But if the evidence is good enough for it, I don't have a theological commitment that I cannot accept them. So if you tell me that tens of thousands of people saw his granddad flying over the Grand Canyon, and it's not just you telling me this, but I can check it out, and yeah, it really seems like that was seen, I'd have to wonder if I'm actually looking at a accurate miracle claim. But just telling the story,
the analogy goes in. Yeah, the analogy goes in steps. So it goes, you turn the page, you have a book. The first page is just the one where it says the guy jumped over the Grand Canyon. You'd say, okay, right now it's just fiction. You turn the page and it says 500. There are 500 eyewitnesses that saw him jump over the Grand Canyon. Now, would you put it in the fiction or the historical section?
Well, if it's all coming from the same one guy, I'm still putting it in fiction. But if you split them up a little, so we have independent minds, then it becomes more believable.
Okay, so we turn the page, we see there's another gospel that's written by multiple sources, and these sources both say that there were 500 eyewitnesses or so that saw this guy fly over the Grand Canyon, historical or mythical.
I mean, I've only got 2 at the moment, so the probability is going. I'm starting to take it a little bit more seriously, but I'm still putting it in mythological for now because I've only got 2, right? All right. So if you go on, yeah, it will reach the point that the miracle claim does become believable. And all
right.
Yeah, I don't have a problem with that.
Yeah, well, that's the question is trying to find out what point does it become believable? What point do you move it from fiction to historical? So usually it's the whole argument takes each one of the different pieces of evidence for the reliability of the gospels and adds them one at a time and figures out, well, when do you actually switch?
Well, like I say, I will make that switch when the evidence becomes good enough, just like I would with your Hindu miracle claim. I don't have any problem with the idea that supernatural events do take place within Hinduism. I'm not Hindu, but that fits within my worldview. I don't have a bias against the idea that it could possibly be true. I just need to be convinced that it actually is, and I can do that if I'm shown something that's good enough, which isn't something that is so high it could never be met. So yeah, I'm a supernaturalist. I'm not embarrassed about that.
From my perspective, it would seem like we have lots of examples of historical claims in history. There's tons of them. Pretty much every historian had miracle claims and magic claims in the early versions of history. And from a methodological perspective, it seemed like we'd be more likely to get it right if we saw them as just figments of their imagination. So like if we had this granddad flew across the Grand Canyon story, it seems like we should just put it in fiction, just leave it there. Doesn't matter what's in the next pages. Like, who cares? It's
that's fiction. The thing. Like, I don't know why a person like you would want to talk with a person like me about why we should take the Gospels seriously historically, because like you're of this commitment that you can't do that.
Well, it's more about why, because I'd be interested to see what reason we should have to change the methodology of history to accept more kinds of these claims. That would be like the main issue, like saying that it has a closer date or that the eyewitnesses wrote it, their eyewitness testimonies or whatever. Like that part is like, I don't care. But I'm more interested in like, why should we be more open to these things when it seems to give us more false positives, seems to give us a less reliable methodology that gives us more inaccurate data, that is just, it just seems like a worse method that doesn't let us get to the truth as often. And for me, that seems like a problem. Like, why should we accept the possibility of unicorns or aliens in historical documents until we actually have evidence of unicorns and aliens existing? It seems like a more reliable way is to say, no, I don't understand the, other than obviously the religious bias reasons to want to believe these things. It doesn't seem like it's a reliable methodological approach to take. And there could obviously be reasons, like you could present evidence that says, oh, we discovered a unicorn. Like in yesterday, the archaeological evidence uncovered fossils of an actual pink unicorn or something. And then we can go back into historical documents and be like, oh, here is a claim of a unicorn. And it's plausible that that is explained by the actual existing pink unicorn. But prior to that, I don't think there's anything we could see that could make belief in the unicorn reliable. So if there's like a story of a unicorn, so there's 500 eyewitnesses of a unicorn, has multiple attestations of different sources, I'd be like, I don't think that's reasonable to believe there is actually a unicorn there. It doesn't make sense to me, or a dragon, or any mythical creature. But you're saying that, or a better way to phrase this is, would you apply this same methodology to things that were non-miracles, magic, unicorns, dragons, those kinds of things, UFOs?
Yeah, I mean, I would. I don't. I mean, since you're an atheist, I kind of wonder what your own position on UFOs would be. Like, is it that unreasonable that, I mean, we would interpret them differently, no doubt, but are UFOs really that the same level as miracle claims for you?
Pretty much, yeah.
Really? Okay.
Because I mean,
that's unusual.
To get aliens to, well, I'd say like to get aliens to our planet, you'd have to go faster than the speed of light, kind of stuff. So in order to get spaceships to here, even like our nearest solar system that has a possibility of obtaining life is hundreds of millions of light years away. So in order for spaceships to get here would take hundreds of millions of years. The idea that aliens would do that is, it's a pretty strange idea. I would consider it as likely as unicorns existing, that there are aliens that actually came here and abducted cows or whatever.
Well, yeah, you would wonder why they wanted to abduct cows if they were so technologically advanced that they could get here. But yeah, I would apply the same logic to if you want UFOs, for example. But yeah, pretty much all of the things you listed. I just, in general, I don't believe there's good evidence for those things. The same way I don't believe there's good evidence for the majority of miracle claims I hear. But there are exceptions, which, yeah, depends on the evidence.
So if there was a historical document with equivalent evidence of the Bible that said dragons and unicorns existed, you would believe in dragons and unicorns?
Well, yeah, basically. But I mean, it's, yeah. I just don't think that such a book exists, with comparable degree of reliability at all.
That's fair.
And the thing is, as well, I don't think you're completely wrong for judging the past by present experience. I think that there are limits to that, which you're probably crossing. But nevertheless, I don't think it's invalid to point that there is no fossil of a unicorn, right? That's a reasonable thing to take into account when you're considering the evidence. But you can't expect something similar, for example, whether or not a man walked on the water. You're not going to find a fossil of somebody who walked on the water to say, we've got another kind of confirmation of this outside of eyewitness testimony. You're just not going to find that.
Well, I'd do the Craig Keener thing for that. So like Craig Keener's book on miracles, the 500-page document or whatever, like if we could actually show miracles did happen today, then I think that would be the same as a fossil. It'd be like something, here's an example of something we know this exists today, and we can then infer it happened in the past, kind of a thing. So I would say we could potentially have equivalent
I think you've got
examples
really.
of
there are millions of people in the world who claim to have witnessed a miracle. I guess you're probably not one of them. Personally, I'm not one of them either. But yeah, I mean, if that's what you're looking for, you've got it, I think.
I have read his book, Craig Keener's book, and I'm very familiar with those. This is a different topic, but it's a fun discussion to go through the best examples he has, because they're not very miraculous and they're very easily explained by known phenomenon psychologically. So I'd say that they're not really evidence of miracles, but that's off topic.
Yeah, right. I mean,
so you wanted to talk about the location, that the Gospels, the authors were in the correct location, something like that, right?
Yeah, I mean, I wonder how much of it is really somebody with your particular set of presuppositions, but hopefully your audience might find it interesting anyway. But in the Gospels, we have 27 different towns that are named. And of those 27, 22 of them we have independent record of. For example, the first writings of the rabbis, etc. So that makes 81%. I've got this from Simon Gallico, by the way. I don't know if you seem to focus less on the historical stuff and more on the philosophical. But if you compare,
well, just to clarify, like, yeah, as far as I know, Josephus, all he does is mention that some people who were Christ followers were talking about stuff. I think that was like the extent of what Josephus says about Jesus.
Oh, sure.
I don't know. Like, there wasn't anything.
Yeah, I should clarify what I mean by that. What I'm saying is that these towns are also mentioned by Josephus. Not that he mentioned that Jesus visited them or his disciples went to them. He simply mentions them as towns in Judea and in the areas that correspond with what the Gospels are describing. So I'm not claiming that he describes Jesus visiting these towns or anything like that.
So what? Because you said there are like several dozen claims that were made, and they were justified by extra biblical sources or whatever. Like, what are the claims?
Yeah, what I'm saying
specifically that are justified?
That there are 27 different towns mentioned in total in the four Gospels, and of those 27, 22 of them are mentioned elsewhere by other people around the same time period. For example, I'm giving Josephus as an example, and he mentions, I think, about half a dozen of them, probably more actually.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. So yeah, I would agree with most of that on the historicity of the cities.
Yeah, right. So I'm saying that the Gospels place the events that they describe in a real time and a real place. I mean, time is a slightly different issue, but they place them at actual locations, in actual places. And these are places which are verified to be places there. They're not being made up by rabbis and by Josephus and so forth. Like, you don't find this with the apocryphal Gospels and so forth. If they name places, they're places which there's no other record of their existence generally, except maybe Jerusalem or something. And when you actually look at the biography of Josephus, written by himself, his autobiography, he mentions in his biography 44 towns, and of those we have independent verification of 35, 80% of them. By comparison, the Gospels, 81% of them we have independent verify of. So it's basically on exactly the same level as far as accuracy and geography that we can measure. So I think this gives us why we should be taking seriously the Gospels as not being works of fiction, but being things which are written about real places, things that were happening in real history. And that should be the attitude that we approach the Gospels with. I'm not saying that more evidence can't be brought in to bear on that should affect the way we see it, but I think that these kinds of things should be starting point with the attitude that we're approaching it with. And from what I can tell, you probably don't seem to actually disagree with me on that. I mean, if you're willing to grant that they're actually eyewitness accounts, then you would presumably grant that John and Matthew were among the disciples of Jesus going around these towns, and they'd know exactly where they were in relation to each other and the kinds of things that were going on in them. So still, the audience.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, I grant they're eyewitnesses for the sake of the argument. I don't think there's actually historical evidence that they are, but
That's kind of why,
think that a lot,
or at least,
yeah, well, I do think there's a lot of accurate things in the Gospels. Like I think the city names are pretty accurate. I think like the attestations of the time period are pretty accurate. Crucifixions are accurate. So I think a lot in the Gospels is accurate historical information. So I'm not going to say it's all false. Literally every line is just fiction. Like, no, I think that a lot of it's true, just like in most historical documents, like Pliny and Suetonius and those guys, they have a lot of accurate history, and then some mythical stuff. And I just admit the mythical stuff. I keep all the other stuff, and I treat the Gospels in the same way, because I would agree that we should keep a consistent method for all historical documents. And I think that a lot of it is historically accurate in the Gospels.
Yeah, so the difference between us would be that part of that consistent method that you apply is the rejection of any supernatural events in them. And I wouldn't include that in mine, but other than that, we'd be more or less on the same page. Apart from the obvious fact that I have concluded that Christianity is true, and that leads to some theological conclusions as well.
Gotcha. And do you have any other aspects of your methodology you want to present?
Yeah, well, you have a similar thing with the distribution of names in the Gospels. For example, you probably know this is pretty well. The most common girl's name in that area at the time was Mary. And the result is that when you read the Gospels, you have like 4 different Marys who have been distinguished from each other. Same thing with Judas. You have Judas, not Iscariot, Judas Iscariot, and the name showing up elsewhere. Same thing with Jesus. Very common name. And you have Jesus Christ. You have, according to some manuscripts, Jesus Barabbas, and other Jesuses that are mentioned. Thanks for the compliment. Again, if you're taking the location and the history, the general historical context seriously, I think this would be a good reason to take it a step further and say that there's good reason to the people involved are themselves historical, because people don't get the distribution of names like that right just by chance, by making up names from, if they're writing, as I think you suggested, if they're well-educated people writing a long way away in a different language, you don't end up with the same consistency in terms of how common different names are. It's hard enough today to do that sort of thing, writing historical fiction. It would have been so much harder back then. And again, if you want to make comparison with the four Gospels, when they make up names for their characters, the names are generally not even Jewish names from the time period at all. Never mind getting the approximate commonality of the names accurate to one another to within about 10% of how common they were at the time. And that's judged by looking at graves and so forth to tell how common certain names were. Richard Balcomb's done quite an extensive study on it. So I think that would challenge the idea that you were suggesting before of them being written a long period distance away by people who were from different ethnicity and background in a different place.
I would say that the stories were passed along verbally, and then the Greeks like transcribed them down. The particular Gospels, as they were written by Greeks who were far away and 50 years later, but the stories themselves came from the time period, and so they kept the names and things, and that's how it had an accurate transcription of accurate names while still being written by Greeks.
Yeah, I think it was also Richard Balcombe who, in his study, observes that the names are usually the first things to get confused when stories are being passed along orally. Within simply 2 or 3 retellings, names begin to get forgotten, and the events might stay roughly the same or what, but actually getting people's names right, I think we observe this just at a personal level as well. If you meet someone new, you ask them their name, you talk to them for a while, you can remember what hobbies they have, you remember what job they have, roughly how old they are, what they look like. But you meet them again, it's like, I know you, but what was your name again? That's been borne out in, like I said, I think it was Richard Balcon's study as well, that these things tend to be the things that are forgotten and confused when it's passed along.
I think there's a difference between culture today and culture back then, and that names were more relevant to your occupations. So, because they didn't have like last names for the most part back then, and so your name was tied this guy who had this job, and so it was more significant and easier to remember for them at that time period than it is for us today. And so I don't think that would be a relevant comparison between the time periods.
Well, you would wonder why the apocryphal gospels would be so unsuccessful in their attempts to preserve realisms.
Yeah, that's fair. Like I would say that a lot of the documents were probably also forged, and so they didn't make sense. All right. Do you have any other parts you wanted to present?
Yeah, I mean, there's a variety of different ways that you can go about these things. But if you consider, for example, I'm sure you've probably heard of undesigned coincidences before, since I think you've done dialogue with Jonathan McClatchy. Are you familiar with those? I suppose you are.
Yep.
So I think this is quite a strong argument for the reliability of the Gospels. For example, if you just take the two that are found in John chapter 6, you have John asked that it was the Passover at the time of the feeding of the 5,000, but the Gospel of Mark tells us nothing about the Passover, but it does comment on how unusually green the grass was and that there were many people coming and going at that time. So I'm assuming mainstream presupposition that John was the last gospel written. That being the case,
yeah,
either John looked at Mark's gospel, saw many people coming, going, green grass, hey, it must be the Passover, or he had an independent line of evidence telling him that it was the Passover that he wrote down, which just happened to fit perfectly with Mark. And that's just one example. I mean, we have many such examples. Another would be Jesus appears to the resurrection, and he says to him, Simon, son of Jonas, do you love me more than these? Referring to the other disciples. And John says, yes, Lord, I love you. He's asked it 3 times. And in the end, it says that he was grieved because Jesus asked him 3 times. It's not hard to see where that comes from. Peter denied him 3 times. Jesus asked him 3 times. But the interesting point is where he says, do you love me more than these? Why would he ask him if he loves him more than the other disciples? There's no sign of that in the Gospel of John. But if you go to the Gospel of Luke, you have Peter boasting that though all the other disciples turn away, I will never turn away from you. And yet he's the one who denied him 3 times. So it makes sense that Jesus would be referring back to that incident, asking the question, do you love me more than they do? I mean, I suppose that automatically comes into something that must be rejected according to your worldview. It's after the resurrection, so it couldn't have happened. But these kinds of things fitting together are, I think, a good sign of authenticity. There's no explanation in John for why Jesus would be asking that question. That explanation is found in Luke, who doesn't record Jesus asking the question. It fits together perfectly, but neither one goes out of the way to explain themselves. And it's kind of hard to explain that if it's not actually historical, I think.
Well, I'd say it's the bereavement delusion. I would seem to explain it.
I'm sorry?
My position is that it was a bereavement delusion. So
Oh, I
30
see.
to 60% of people who have a dead loved one will see or touch or interact with that dead loved one after they've died. And it's usually with relevant things that they've done before, cooking, cleaning, whatever. And so it's usually tied into a narrative of whatever happened recently or that they're known for. And so the fact that there's a similarity between what the person was doing before they died and what they were speaking about after they died would be making a lot of sense. That's what we see in most bereavement delusions.
Okay, so you would accept as historical then Peter's denials of Jesus and his boast that he loved Jesus more than the other disciples. If they fell
Sure.
away, he wouldn't.
Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. I mean, obviously the bereavement delusion theory is nothing new. Yeah, it's normally called the visions or hallucinations hypothesis. But yeah, I think the issues with that, because there are other people there apparently experiencing the same thing and so forth. But yeah, obviously,
Well,
I see
that's
where you're
well, so bereavement delusions actually happen to multiple people. They're delusions and hallucinations that happen to multiple people are not actually that rare. It's called folie à deux, and you can folie à trois and all the different French numbers. So there's hallucinations and delusions do happen and are shared between people groups, but I think it's more likely that it's communal reinforcement. So like if somebody sees something they can't explain or has a bereavement delusion and they tell other people about it, the bereavement delusion can be shared through communal reinforcement, which is really common. So that's also a common thing psychologically. So I think that's most likely what happened was that they probably had a bereavement delusion, and that bereavement delusion was shared among the apostles through stories, and it was adopted as a communal reinforcement factor.
Do these delusions include such things as eating meals together and so forth with physical contact?
Yep.
Okay. Okay, that's. I seriously doubt that, to be honest. But I mean, if you've got
check it for yourself. Just Google bereavement delusions and visceral bereavement delusions and eating together with dead loved ones, hearing and speaking to dead loved ones and touching them. It's pretty common. Bereavement delusions happen to 30 to 60% of people, elderly people who have dead loved ones. So it's really common.
Uh-huh. Yeah. I mean, would you care to explain your view of the conversion of the Apostle Paul then?
The what?
The conversion of the Apostle Paul and of Jesus' brother James.
Also bereavement delusion. So another thing we often see is that people who are persecuting others will feel guilt, and through guilt you can have a bereavement delusion. So like if someone was the Nazi or whatever persecuting the Jews, they could have visions of the Jewish Messiah, Jehovah or God or whatever, and convert to Judaism. And so there's also many accounts of people who were persecuting and killing a particular group, whatever that group may be, and they had visions from their particular deity of the group they were killing because it was so present in their minds. They were always hearing stories of this person and it was very relevant to their lives, which can cause them to have similar kinds of bereavement delusions from the guilt of torturing the people.
Huh. Do these types of bereavement delusions, are they known to result in people concluding that the person has raised from the dead rather than that they've had the bereavement delusion?
Most people believe that, yes. Most people are under the impression that they actually saw something like that throughout most history. It's only more recently, since we understand the psychology behind it, that is not the general conclusion, and only among people who understand that. So yes, most people actually believe they literally spoke to a dead loved one who literally came to them.
Well, like as a ghost or something, not natural resurrection, right?
Depends on the culture. It depends on culturally what they believe and how it works. And so it's essentially what they tend to interpret it as is whatever they think is relevant to their cultural beliefs and how that would happen in their culture. And that's just how, whatever they determine it is.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. Have you studied the Jewish expectations about the resurrection and eschatology in the first century at all?
Yes, it wasn't even supposed to die in the first place. So that's why most Jews didn't convert to Christianity, because it didn't seem to fit with the Jewish narrative. So yes, but the apostles did think he was going to rise, because he literally said he's going to rise 3 days later. So that was an expected thing from the apostles.
So you actually believe Jesus said that then? That he was going
Yes.
to rise 3 days later?
Yeah.
That's a pretty unusual position in unbelieving scholarship, isn't it?
I think so, probably. I don't know, because I think that it's more of like a gray area. Like I think a lot of the testimony of what he said is essentially just taken for granted. I think the things that are like doubted are like the empty tomb, like that one's highly doubted, but a lot of the other stuff is usually accepted, that he was crucified. There were 3 people that he was crucified with. He was at some point taken off the cross, stabbed. Like all of those things are gray area, but most of it's essentially accepted. The empty tomb is highly contested, though.
Yeah, I mean, it's contested, but you're still talking like about 70% plus, aren't you, for the empty tomb?
No, the empty tomb is minority position. Gary Habermas presented that as one of his minimal facts, and then when it was, but his poll, the poll he did was a private poll via email of scholars that he knew, and he never published the private poll. And then a follow-up was done by academics in chief to try to confirm it, and they found out that the vast majority of scholars don't actually agree on that one particular. And so Gary Habermas recanted on that position and said he doesn't use that one as one of the minimal facts anymore, or something along those lines.
Yeah, I remember a slightly different account of that. Like the majority was not as large as he was presenting it to be. And he was including scholars who accepted it, but only on the grounds that it wasn't, with the implications that you would normally attach with it and that sort of thing. But I'm pretty sure it was still a majority position, just a slimmer majority than he thought. But it only has really. So,
yeah.
Yeah. So, have you considered the fact that, I'm sure you probably have, the Gospels would have been written within the lifetime of other eyewitnesses?
Sure, like even, yeah, I think like even the least generous estimates say that the earliest Gospels were like 50 to 75 years after the death of Jesus or whatever. So yeah.
Yeah, I would say. But you don't think that there would have been an attempt to correct them if they were providing false information by the Romans, by the British leaders, anybody like that?
Well, I imagine there would be attempts to correct them whether or not there was, like, people who would just deny them, like the Romans would probably denounce them if they had the opportunity anyway. But I don't consider the Gospels to be any more historically inaccurate than any other historical document at the time period. Like I don't think that it would be like problematic, like if they put in something like dragons came and killed everyone or something. Like, yeah, that would be far less believable. But I don't generally consider the Gospels to be historically unreliable. I just don't accept the miracle stuff. So I think that as historical documents, they are perfectly legitimate historical documents.
Yeah, well, I mean, that was what I was expected to be presenting, the case that they are reliable historical documents. Somebody has a presupposition that I'm to accept the miracle claims in them, then I think there's a different philosophical discussion that needs to be had that is kind of separate from the historical one, which it seems like we kind of agree on. And I think philosophy is probably more of your thing, and yeah, I was here.
Would you say, like, I think it's the majority position that most historians agree that the vast majority of them is historical?
Well, I think, to be fair, you have the fact that the majority of New Testament scholars are Christians, to be fair. So they are going to accept the idea that they're historical because they're Christians. Same do I.
Well, even among secular scholars, they accept most of them, right? They accept most of the stuff in the Gospels, like the city names, the names of the people, the historical accounts of what happened.
Yeah. I mean, it comes to issues like the sayings of Jesus, that tend to be questioned. I think there's a good reason to accept them, of course, and it seems like you don't have a problem with that. But yeah,
Yeah, I think the one I definitely would get rid of is the one where he knelt down in the sand and drew, "He who's without sin can cast the first stone," or whatever. That I think we can conclusively determine came from like a 14th century monk or something, because it's only in the versions after the 14th century monk and none of the ones before it.
Yeah, I think you're getting a little confused there. You're probably referring to 1 John 5:7 with the 14th century, because there are no Greek manuscripts with that. And I would agree with your conclusion. The writing in the sand is much earlier. Having said it's much earlier, that doesn't mean it's authentic.
Right.
It's not consistently found, in the earliest manuscripts of the Gospel of John. I think it shows up in Luke in one situation, and most scholars don't believe it's authentic. But 1 John 5:7, yeah, it's about the time period that you're pointing out. The passage in John's Gospel is much, much earlier, and I think it's quite likely actually historical, but again, not something that John wrote.
Gotcha. We do have some questions from the audience, if you don't mind.
Yeah, go ahead, sure.
Iron Cherry Tear asks, why does the story of Jesus follow almost the same trajectory as a lot of Greek gods? Is that evidence for Hellenization of the Jews?
Yeah, basically, I don't think it does follow almost the same trajectory as a lot of Greek gods. I'm not saying there's no resemblance whatsoever, but it's massively overplayed. The virgin birth of Jesus is not comparable to a god being born from a rock, for example. And these are the kinds of things that you get when you actually look at the comparison from the original sources, not from a blog post that's telling us about them. And the same goes for the other events that are generally put down. Either they're not there or their similarities are greatly exaggerated. So, yeah, no, I don't think so.
Gotcha. Joking Atheist asks, if he would have no problem accepting the miracle based on the criterion, how would he then square his own belief system against that of the other religious claims? Does his religion allow for other religions existing and having miracles?
Yeah, it totally agrees it's totally consistent with the idea that other religions can have miracles, genuinely supernatural event them. Even the book of Acts records that there was a Simon the sorcerer who was performing some kind of supernatural feat that had people in awe of him. So yeah, that's completely consistent with my worldview. But I think Christianity as a worldview is more coherent than any other that I've looked at, including atheism, but that's just one worldview among many. I don't think it's rational or sensible to determine which religion is true based purely on do they have a miracle claim that can be verified. I think you can join more than one religion that way. But there are other things to consider. Other historical claims, even non-miraculous ones, that a religion makes. Religions can be demonstrated to be more or less likely true based on historical claims, even non-miraculous ones. And the theology behind it, is it something that is consistent with itself? Does it actually provide a way of salvation that a person can accept and follow through with? Christianity is, I'm convinced it's true, and not just based on miracle claims, although that's certainly something to be considered.
Gotcha. Locor asks, who recorded the conversations of agonizing Jesus on the cross with the two other convicts? Were there anybody within earshot?
Well, we know that, this is obviously, if we accept the Gospels at face value, that Jesus spoke to the Apostle John, or whoever the beloved disciple was, from the cross. And they're within earshot. So that's two people already. We know that there were other women who were somewhere near the cross, presumably within earshot as well. So, yeah, those are the obvious answers. But I also add, according to the Gospels and according to Christianity, the entire New Testament, Jesus rose from the dead. So he appeared to his disciples afterwards. He could have told them anything after that as well. Obviously, that requires accepting resurrection, which they aren't going to do. Well, they're still atheists at least, but yeah, there were people within earshot of the cross, and Jesus spoke to his disciples afterwards.
Gotcha. Nidemus asks, how many other proto-Christians, Jewish, or contemporary spiritual texts has KingsServant read?
I've read most of the intertestamental apocrypha, including the Book of Enoch and so forth. Yeah, I have a copy of the Gnostic Gospels. I haven't got through reading it yet. I've
Gotcha.
read a lot of the Dead Sea Scrolls as well, but not a great deal.
Gotcha. Joking Atheist says, does his belief rely on the Gospels and the historical evidence, or is it based on something more personal? If so, what is that?
Good question. Based on the entire worldview. So there's not a single piece of evidence that I hang everything on, but rather I'm comparing the worldview that Christianity offers and as an explanation of everything compared to any other worldview on the table. And I don't find that anything else comes remotely close to that. Other people are going to disagree, of course, but yeah, there's the question of historical evidence, the question of how best to explain the resurrection of Christianity isn't true. And yeah, I'm allowing for Hinduistic explanations and so forth to be considered. I think Christianity has the most reasonable one. And that, includes prophecies, includes my presence, and includes what we can tell about the world around us, and theological coherence with itself and with reality.
Gotcha. Iris Gaming asked, how does he disregard all of the evidence from other holy books?
Yeah, I don't. So, as I was saying earlier, if a miracle claim does have a comparable degree of evidence in its favor, I'll accept it. Doesn't mean I'll accept a religion, but there's nothing in my worldview that means I can't accept supernatural events happening outside of my religion. But having said that, if you're talking about evidence in favor of other religions and their holy books being true, yeah, bring me the holy book up, we'll take a look at it. And I've done that, Most of my interaction has been with Muslims. The Quran is an absolute disaster. And I think TJump would probably agree with me on that compared with the Gospels in terms of history it is. The Book of Mormon is just as bad as the Quran, maybe a little bit worse. So yeah, it's pretty easy when you actually look at them. But I can't just disregard them at hand. You're right about that.
Gotcha. Big Bad Mama asks, KingsServant, can you name one history written during Jesus' supposed life?
During. Well, Josephus would be, I think, a couple of decades after. No, I don't think so. I mean, I would actually argue that it's quite possible that parts of the Gospel of Matthew may have been written down by Matthew as he was accompanying Jesus. But that is not something provable. Personally, I think it's quite likely. I find the arguments for that as likely a theory as anything else about the origins of Matthew's Gospel. But yeah, not that I can prove.
Gotcha. Martin asks, has our guest experienced any miracles, or does he believe they could happen today?
I don't think I've experienced any miracles of the kind that we're talking about. Resurrections, healings, sorts of things. Anything I've experienced would be quite subjective, to be honest. So I wouldn't go around claiming I've witnessed any miracles. Do I believe that they could happen today? Certainly. And although I'm not one of them, there are many many Christians and non-Christians in the world who would say that they have witnessed them or experienced them. And I don't think that we should disregard what they have to say just because they're making a supernatural claim.
Joking Atheist asks, which of the reasons does his belief rely upon the most?
Good question. I don't know that I could single out one, but I could probably single out 3 or 4 maybe. So I think the argument from prophecy in the Old Testament being fulfilled in Jesus' life is very important. The resurrection and personal experience along with that. Yeah, and the experience of other people as well. The gospel changes lives, and that is something objective that takes place around us. I'm not saying it's the only thing. I'm not saying other religions can't make similar claims as well, but putting everything together. I should also mention theological coherence. All of the alternatives about how to achieve forgiveness by God, whether it's dying as a martyr, having your good deeds outweigh bad deeds, whatever, I think when they're examined, you can see that there is no possibility of salvation through means like that. Christianity offers the only reasonable solution for how a person can have forgiveness and peace with God. And it's by God's grace being shown to us because we don't deserve it at all. That is the reality. And I think if we look inside of our hearts and we look at what is going on around us, what people really like, without trying to be overly optimistic, we see that, yeah, if there's any hope for us, it's purely the grace of God. That's something that I find very compelling. It's the reasonable solution for the situation that we're in.
Gotcha. Benjamin Thomas Blodgett asked, does a writing taking place during a real time and place mean it was true?
Not necessarily, but it does mean that you should take it seriously. And you should start off with the idea that these people probably are telling you something that is based in reality. It doesn't mean that they couldn't be lying, but you don't automatically assume that they're lying. You have a good reason to begin with that you're getting reliable information. It's coming from a time and location, from people who would know what they're talking about. And so that's the way you should start.
Brian Stevens asked his thoughts on Josephus remaining Jewish. Wouldn't it have been better ability to investigate this than us? If he wasn't convinced that Jesus was Lord, shouldn't we not be convinced too?
Yeah, I think this goes back to what I was saying about human nature to begin with. According to the Gospels, if they can be believed, there were guards at the tomb of Jesus when the resurrection happened, and he was angels appeared and they were completely knocked out by the experience. They went to the Jewish leaders and said, hey, he's risen from the dead. And they say, here's some money to stay quiet. And they actually did it. There's something about the human heart that if it's not regenerated and born again by the work of the Holy Spirit, it will choose to reject anything, no matter how clear. It's not a lack of evidence that's man's problem or Josephus's problem.
Gotcha. Lou Core asks, who recorded the conversation of the agonizing Jesus or the cross? I think we already went over that one.
So.
And Javier asks, Spider-Man analogy relevant here? I guess so. We would go over that one too, though. So, Benjamin, can you think of a situation where someone honestly recording one of the gospel accounts, but where some of its content didn't actually happen?
One of these gospel accounts, meaning the 4 gospels. Well, like I say, I hold as a matter of theology that the gospels are inerrant, so that wouldn't be relevant to me. I conclude that because of other prior evidence that convinces me that Christianity is true, and I think it's theologically inconsistent to believe Christianity is true, but what is inspired by God has errors in it. There are other Christians who disagree with me on that. Some of them are good scholars, but I don't think they're good theologians.
Gotcha. Benjamin asks, which parts of the Gospels do you think the evidence against being true?
Which parts of the Gospels do you think are evidence against them being true? I think, for me personally, obviously I believe they are true, but like the hardest things for the Christian to deal with in the Gospels would probably be things like in the Gospel of Matthew, where it mentions the resurrections of the other people at the time of the crucifixion. That isn't mentioned in any of the other Gospels. Like that's probably the most challenging aspect of the Gospels to deal with. Why does only one Gospel mention this? Yeah, but ultimately, I don't find it a convincing reason to reject the Gospels. Sometimes things are just recorded by one Gospel, such as the raising of Lazarus, for example. Jesus' ministry was especially miraculous, and there were many things that they didn't have room in their standard-sized scrolls to write about.
Gotcha. Iron Cherry Tier asked, was the concept of a resurrection part of the Jewish doctrine, or was Paul, a Hellenized Jew, extolling these concepts to Jew and the Gentiles?
Yeah, the concept of the resurrection was part of Jewish doctrine, but they had a very particular way that they expected the resurrection to happen. They expected a single general resurrection at the end of time. They were not expecting anybody to be resurrected before that. So the resurrection of Jesus is not something that they would have been expecting, unless it was based on Jesus' own words, which it seemed like they'd temporarily forgotten. That is the disciples. But yeah, Paul was extolling this, obviously, following the resurrection to both Jews and Gentiles. And the Gentile reaction was that was a completely bizarre idea. Why would anybody want to get resurrected? They saw death as being freedom from this body, a kind of Gnostic-like view of things. When he preached Jesus and the resurrection to Gentiles, they did not get the fact that he was talking about the resurrection of Jesus. They thought there was a God called resurrection, and he was preaching two new gods to them. The idea of resurrection was completely not in the Gentiles' minds at all.
Gotcha. Benjamin Badgett asked, do you think it's more likely that sorcerers are performing actual magic or performing illusions? Do we have any evidence of actual magic today? I think that's a good question. Like, people see magicians doing magic all the time.
Yeah, right.
If we took that as a historical document, would that be evidence of magic from your methodology?
Yeah, I mean, when you're talking about magic today, and like we've got to distinguish between trickery and actual supernatural events. I think both exist today. I think trickery is far more common, especially like if you go to a magic show. I don't think you're going to be witnessing the natural events, at least not generally. But yeah, I think both exist. But I think
the question is more like, if Penn and Teller existed 2,000 years ago and did magic, and there were eyewitness testimonies of them doing magic, and you read the documents of them recording them doing magic, would you consider that evidence magic actually exists? Because the documents have claims that this is real magic, and they have all the attestations and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I can really answer a question like that, and it's not because I'm unwilling to. It would depend what kind of thing that he could do that would produce what kind of miracle claim that would be convincing or not. Like you give the example of somebody flying over the Grand Canyon. If he did something of that nature that was witnessed by enough people, I would conclude this doesn't look like trickery. I don't think anybody can do this naturalistically. But if he's pulling rabbits out of hats, then that's a different case, right? And I'm not completely without skepticism. You just got to reach a reasonable level where I think it's actually the best explanation. It's a supernatural one. I would like to comment on the first part of that question, though. Do you think it's more likely that sorcerers were performing actual magic or magical illusions? I do think that there is a case to be made that they were performing illusions. There's a link between the word used for sorcery and the word for drugs back then. So, to be fair, yeah, I do think there was a genuine non-supernatural link with sorcerers as well. Pharmaceutica is the word in Greek, right? From which you get pharmacies and drugs. So I do think that there's a lot of trickery back then and still a lot of trickery now. But nevertheless, in some cases, I do believe that the evidence points towards actual supernatural events and has done throughout time. This isn't just a first century thing. Having said that, you know, there's plenty of fakes as well. So yeah, both need to be taken into account.
Doc Player Monod asks, who recorded the conversation with Herod behind closed doors during his third, or who recorded the conversation behind closed doors with Herod during his trial?
Good question. I'm thinking there is actually a link between some of Jesus' disciples and people who were in Herod's court. I forget it's Susanna or Joanna, but one of them was the wife of someone who was very high up in Herod's court, who could have easily been present at such a conversation. So yeah, it's not like this stuff would have to have been made up. There's very reasonable ways that this could have reached the disciples. John himself had connections with Herod's court teams, possibly. Yeah, either Susanna or Joanna also had very close connection. I think she was married to someone who was in Herod's court, so it could have come through John hearing it from someone, or through Joanna or Susanna.
Gotcha. Eves asks, why is the resurrection report between Matthew and John so different?
Yeah, I don't think John was interested in repeating everything that the Synoptic Gospels had already said. It's quite an interesting observation, actually. A number of scholars have tried to find the sources of John in terms of splitting them up the same way they have done with the Synoptic Gospels. You know, you've got Q, you've got what they take from Mark, and unique sources of their own. They've never succeeded in doing it with John. John simply cannot be split up in such a way. As one scholar said, if John was using sources, it looked as though he wrote them on himself. I think that John is an eyewitness account, and yeah, he's telling things from his own experience. No doubt he probably had a scribe that was writing it down for him. And yeah, Matthew told things his way, and John wasn't interested in repeating what the other three synoptics had already said. And I don't think that there's necessarily a contradiction between them. You can find harmonies and so forth. Some people would prefer to explain things as contradictions, but I think they can be explained equally well in other ways.
Travis asks, can you ask him if he would believe in Christianity if there was no heaven or hell?
Yeah, I would. Because I think it's true. And yeah, there's not a lifestyle I would rather live than what I've got. But ultimately, you know, you want to believe stuff because it's true, not because it gets you out of hell.
Bacon Sarni Geddon asks, why does KS think that his religion's magical birth story is so much less ridiculous than the Greek religion's magical birth stories? How do you tell plausible magic from fake magic?
Yeah, because one's in real history and the other isn't. That's what makes the difference. You're actually looking at with the Gospels. Luke's account appears to have come straight from Mary, for example. And you have real people with real names in real places. And this is what you have with the Gospels. Greek religion's magical birth stories have no connection with reality. it mythology, that is the genre. You have Greco-Roman biography versus mythology, and the mythology doesn't make any attempt to even look historical. I mean, I don't think we can straight up verify the virgin birth, right? There's no way we can do that. But there are other things that we have, like the resurrection, that we have the kind of evidence that you would expect for that sort of thing. You can't verify the virgin birth that way. You have it as a theological conclusion based on Christianity being true, based on good reasons to believe in it.
Iron Charioteer asked, do you think the prophecy in Isaiah 53 speaks about Jesus, or could it be applied to any Messiah figure?
Yeah, very, very uniquely so. And you have the death of Jesus being described, the substitutionary atonement of Jesus, as well as his burial with a rich man in the tomb of the rich man, and so forth. The deity of the Messiah, as well as his humanity, is found in Isaiah 53, as well as his resurrection being quite clearly implied. There's no one else that could be about. And if you're interested in that, I'd encourage you to check out Anthology's debate with Shadid Lewis on Isaiah 53. He's got another debate on the same subject coming up with Osama Abdullah, both Muslim apologists.
Where are those? Can we find those?
The most obvious place to
channel?
look is Anthony Rogers' YouTube channel, but they will be available on Ministry to Muslims and probably CCI Ministries as well. She took over David Wood's channel as well, but I'm sure she'd probably upload it when available. I think it's taking place in approximately a week, the next one.
Gotcha. Doc Claremont asked, if they were eyewitnesses, why would Matthew borrow 80% of Mark's material and Luke 65% of the material from the earliest Gospels?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. Not something that I really managed to get into, but the source of Gospels is, a very complex question. I do personally accept the idea that out of the four Gospels that we have, Mark's material is, Mark was the first Gospel written and completed. But I think that that's very possibly based on notes that were taken by Matthew during the ministry of Jesus, and with Peter's testimony, of course. There's very strong evidence linking Mark's material to Peter. Luke was not an eyewitness, so he is relying on other sources. He makes that pretty clear from the beginning of his gospel. So, surprising he would go to Mark. I think Matthew is perhaps indirectly behind a lot of Mark as well. And it's not actually obligatory for a Christian to believe that Matthew and Matthew. Just to be clear about that, there are some very real questions about that. I do think that he did write it, but I do think that he was using Mark's material, which could have close links to him as well as Peter. And yeah, there is literary dependence and interchange going on between them. That's pretty obvious, as well as the question of Q. The sayings that Matthew have in common that aren't found in Mark. Did they get these from? I think they probably did. But there's also the question, were these oral traditions that had been carefully memorized and were being lived in the Christian churches and written down as well? So it's a good question, but I don't think too much about the reliability, apart from say that Matthew and Luke stuff from earlier sources, as well as Q as well, which would be earlier than and possibly earlier than Mark. If you're placing John in, let's say, AD 68, let's say Matthew and Luke in AD 60, Mark's got to be earlier still and got to be circulating by the time that Matthew and Luke are writing, that they have copies of it, because there's clearly a literary relationship between them. how early is Mark going to be? Then you've got the question of Q, if it does exist, or if that early is still oral traditions known to both Matthew and Luke and very widespread. Yeah, I think we've got some very reliable sources on our hands.
Gotcha. Benjamin asks, you find the gospel, you conclude the gospels are inerrant. What does a part of the Bible in any way claim that the Bible is inerrant? And is this Protestant or Catholic Bible?
Yeah, so I hold to the 66 books of the Protestant canon. And if you don't know already, you should know that these 66 books are all accepted by Roman Catholics as well. They include further books in them. But yeah, does any part of the Bible anywhere claim that the Bible is inerrant? I think that is the avoidable teaching of the book of Timothy, where Paul says that the scriptures were breathed out by God. Does God breathe out mistakes? Does he breathe out lies? No, it's also written that it's impossible for God to lie. So if this is the Holy Spirit breathed out word of God, it's not going to have error. That's just bad theology to think it does. Like I said, there are good historians and good scholars who I accept as my brothers and sisters who disagree with me on that, but they're not good theologians, even if they're good historians. So that's how I conclude they're inerrant. First, I conclude that Christianity is true because I believe it to be superior to any other alternative, including agnosticism, saying I don't know. I think Christianity is more believable than not to take a position. And once I've done that, having accepted the Bible as being what it claims to be, breathed out by God, I then accept it necessarily as following from that it doesn't have errors in it. In the original manuscripts, of course, we've talked about what you mentioned, 1 John 5:7 and John 8, etc. So
Rembrandt asks, how was Jesus born during the days of Herod and during Quirinius's census?
Yeah, there's different explanations of that. It doesn't have to be a error. One option is that Quirinius was governor more than once, and there is some evidence to support. Another explanation is that verse has simply been mistranslated, and it actually says this was not the census that was taken when Quirinius was governor of Syria. So either one of those options would deal with the issue. It may be that verse has been traditionally mistranslated and it wasn't Quirinius' census, or it may be that Quirinius was actually governor twice, and so he was governor when Herod was in charge. I prefer the option that Quirinius was governor twice, since, as far as I remember, I'll have to look it up again, in his book, New Testament Documents, Are They Reliable? F.F. Bruce does cover that in quite a decent amount of depth, pointing to some suggestions that why Quirinius may have been governor more than once.
Gotcha. Last question from Doc Palermo. How did Jesus Iscariot die? Hanging or falling headlong and his gut bursting open?
What a way to end. Yeah, so basically, he went out and hanged himself, as the gospel tells us. That being the case, eventually, if you hang off a rope long enough by the neck, things going to give, whether it's the rope or your neck. And especially if a long time has elapsed, the result is that you fall headlong and very likely do burst open. So, yeah, both are true. And
right.
Yeah, there's a detailed medical explanation of what happens to your guts if you want it, but you can look that up. You don't need that from me.
And we did just get a super chat from Benjamin, so I'll do that because money. Because Paul, a man, says Scripture is God breathed to him is the Old Testament, you conclude he means that his own letters are breathed by God?
I do conclude that, but not directly. There's several steps to the process. And I do that as an example. You have a similar thing with Peter. He says that no scripture was given by man's desire, but was written by men carried along by the Holy Spirit. It's kind of hard to imagine people carried along by the Holy Spirit writing errors. So, yeah, he's talking about the Old Testament in the context, but you also have the prophecy of Jesus coming of the Holy Spirit in John 14, who is going to bring further teaching. And the Holy Spirit came at Pentecost. And the apostles are the people who have been appointed by Jesus to be those who continue his teaching through the Holy Spirit. Paul is included as an apostle, and the apostles verify that in various places in Acts and so forth. So, yeah, if God has teaching for us, as per the Old Testament, how much more should the New Testament after the coming of his Son also be similarly inerrant? It also doesn't make sense, just logically, for God to be leaving us with his teaching in errant works and just leaving it up to us and find where the errors are and what parts of it we can believe or can't. Yeah, it's not theologically coherent unless inerrancy is true, I think. Yeah, people disagree on that, but it certainly makes more sense biblically and theologically to me.
Gotcha. Well, that's it for the questions. We've been going for about 2 hours. It was a great conversation. Really appreciate you coming on. Do you want to give any links or references where people can find out more about your work?
Well, the most obvious place to go is my YouTube channel, KingsServant. Most of my material there is aimed at either Muslims or Jehovah's Witnesses, not very much on atheism, but I know your man Jeff enjoyed it, so there might be some other atheists who are interested in that as well. Other than that, I might just mention I've got a debate coming up on the gospel truth with a Muslim apologist, the second half of Matthew's gospel, on whether or not it teaches that Jesus is God. So you might want to check that out if that's something that would be interesting to you. And, thank you very much for your time. Thanks for listening. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thanks again for coming on. Really appreciate it. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. See you.
You too.